Hello, it's been a while since I've made a video, but I thought this would be a cool opportunity to demonstrate something new that I learned about mocking. And so mocking is used when you're testing, generally, unit testing. And that's because it can remove dependencies from your tests. Specifically, calls to the database, calls to caching, things like that. Make your life a little bit easier. And so in this example here, we are making two calls to objects that we generally wouldn't want to call during a unit test unless we're testing the functionality of that object. And so this function is active user. And what it's doing is it's checking to see whether or not a user is active, has the attribute of being active. And so first, to avoid calling the DB, we're using Laravel's cache method. And we're checking to see if user ID is stored inside of cache. If it's not stored inside of cache, we're calling the database, we're retrieving the value for is active at the user ID, and then we're storing that response inside of the cache for 30 minutes. And then finally, we check to see if is active is equal to active, and if that's true, then the user is active. Hence the return of a Boolean response here. If we want to test this, if we actually trigger this cache, or if we actually trigger this database to make a call, it can be dangerous. Because if we, for example, call this put method inside of so we run a test, we call this put method, the user ID that we specified is going to be alive for 30 minutes. Also, if we don't want to call a specific user or create a specific user, something that we can do is use mocking, which is basically telling the instances what they should expect. So we make a mock of an object, or a mock in this case of cache and DB, and we tell them what they're going to receive and what they should return so that the application runs as if it's real time. And so the way I've set this up is pretty simple. Once you call, like Laravel does it really well, honestly. So once you call should receive, Laravel creates a mock of this cache. And so once you create a mock of the cache, you're not actually receiving anything, um, but you're more so instructing a cache element inside of a function on how it should behave. So here we're saying this cache should receive a get once with the user ID passed and return null. So that'll make sure that regardless of whether or not user ID is inside our cache object, our global cache object, null is going to be returned. Then the DB is going to be called with a table where and value statements once, and it's going to return active regardless of everything, again, because we're telling it to return active. And just to even go further here, I haven't even connected a DB to this project. I just spun this up in a couple minutes. And finally, we have this should receive put once. Then we make the cache partial, and we assert that the response that we get from this function is true, right? So let's run through this with debugger. I'm actually going to put some stop points here so we can just track through the events that happen. So let's go to the test, and we're going to go ahead and run this in debugger. And cool, so we're sending, so this is a cache step, it should return null as we specified, boom, return null. So that means inactive is false, so we should enter this loop, and we are going to get the mock instance of the DB, it should return active, right? So if we look at is active is set to active now. We can see that down here. And finally, we're going to put is active inside of our cache. And we're going to check is active. Is active. And we can see that the test passed here. So that's just a small example of how this works. If you have any questions, go ahead and ask. I'll get back to you as soon as I can. And yeah, I hope you found this video useful and informative. Thanks.